right?
Yeah, you posted the YouTube one in the Crazy Friday channel.
Way up there.
Yeah. Okay. So what we are going to do, well, let's go over to a different browser. Here is, okay, this Phil's discussion on whether or not APIs, API management should be wrapped around microservices. Let's get some context behind that. Kelly is, for a long time, the mandate has been that if you have a service that is being used, it goes through one of our registries. It is a managed service. And the only exceptions to that had to be cleared through Kelly. And we only had 3 we ever came up with. And most of those had to do with CAS and turning the logging capabilities of the devices into of the APIs, the API managers into password gathering engines. And which was not obviously what we wanted to do. The question came up in a Crazy Friday, and this was posted last year, I believe, about 6 months ago. Yeah, almost a year ago now. The question came up, there was a discussion about microservices and whether or not they had to go through, in this case it would be WSO2, and be managed, have their APIs be managed like everything else. And so Phil wrote this blog post on his blogs. If you have never been to windley.com, you probably ought to go and poke around a little bit. But Phil wrote this after that discussion, and his take on everything is essentially that, yes, microservices need to be managed the same way that any other service is. The fact that it's called a microservice is irrelevant. And so we were tasked, there was Alex asked a question a little while ago on Slack saying, hey, when do microservices have to be in there or not? And there was a little bit of discussion back and forth, and Joseph said, oh, no, we do this with our microservices. We just pass our own JWT around and want to worry about it. And so we decided that maybe what we really ought to do is come up with a policy statement on when microservices really truly need to be managed, and when it's okay to take a service or have a series of services working together and have them not have to worry about being managed by some kind of an API manager. And when I say API manager, it might not be WSO2. It might be AWS's just API gateway may be sufficient. Because it allows a number of the things that WSO2 does, but it's not nearly as feature rich as WSO2. But for certain instances, that may be all that is necessary. So that's the crux of the discussion. And if you go to Phil's blog, he has one statement right here in the blog that where he kind of starts everything that says, we have to ensure the only way to access service APIs is through the managed API endpoint. And API management handles discovery, security, identity, orchestration, interface uniformity, versioning, traffic shaping, monitoring, and metering. Internal APIs, even those between microservices, need those just as badly as external APIs. That's his contention, basically. And then there's this, he talks about, well, then everybody starts yelling and screaming about that's going to be a performance nightmare, and he goes on to answer that. But that's the question. That's the topic of discussion. I've been tasked to write the document for AppDev to say, what is our policy? And, when is it okay and when is it not? Because, if the problem in the past literally has been we've left it up to the developers to choose, and we've had a lot of developers go around the registries thinking they have perfectly good reasons, and now we have a huge mess to clean up. And and that's not, we can't even tell who's using anything, because there are entries in the reverse proxies that skip everything, and and we, other than going through the Apache logs, which we only keep a month of, there's no way to tell.
So is the best way to make that decision, obviously from Phil's side, I think Kelly would generally agree with Phil, that everything should be, so why don't we maybe talk about the places where it's okay.
And that's kind of what we were shooting at. Let me bring up a document that is actually, this diagram's out on the wiki. It might still be under just my personal space, but this document's out on the wiki. This is something I put together a while ago, saying we have this kind of identity architecture, things that we are trying to do, and this kind of illustrates the problems that we were trying to solve with JWTs and some of that. But if you look at the diagram, you kind of have the standard OAuth stuff that we've always talked about, and that is out there. It's implemented. WSO2 is handling it for us. And you have service, application A wants to call service B. It can, there's a JWT going through, and we're not going to worry about the whole JWT stuff that's in here, but just the overall architecture. And so you have service B. Service B wants to call some other service. It goes through either another auth server or the same auth server. J and K could be the same thing. And right now, that's how we have it architected. But service B goes through another auth server and another API manager to call service C. The question comes in, okay, what happens when you have this domain out here of microservices that are performing a function, and sticking to some DDD principles? Basically, you have a domain gateway out there somewhere, and it itself may be a microservice. It may be something a little more robust than that. But it's the domain gateway. It's, I am the gateway in. You can't talk to any of my services without coming through me.
So they're all private.
So they are all private, except for this domain gateway. And so, and then they communicate amongst themselves, however they need to communicate. And the question is, how do you draw this circle? That's really the question. Is when is that? When is a microservice service C? And one is a microservice, a participant in some domain or subdomain out there that it is so small, so specialized that it really is only for use inside of some sort of subdomain. And because that's really the boundary that I think that needs to be drawn, is when is that the appropriate way to do things, and what are the requirements if you're doing something like this? What are the requirements of these microservices? Do they still have to go through a gateway because you need to be able to throttle them? You need to be able to manage them. Do they, AWS may be a perfectly appropriate gateway in that case, and the only thing they're passing back and forth is an API key. And because you can do that, you can secure them with an API key, put them in a private, basically a VPC, and they can just run on their own. But how do we draw that? How do we kind of draw that circle and say what?
Go back to the things that Phil mentioned were important to have.
Yeah.
See.
Measure his vote a little bit.
And I don't necessarily agree with what I'm about to say, but a starting point possibly is Amazon's old rule about when you had to use an API, which was anytime it crosses boundaries of a team. Anytime you're calling software written by another team, they had to use an API. There had to be an API there, and they had to be consuming it. They couldn't do in-memory, they couldn't talk to databases, they couldn't do any of that. And that's how they got their API proliferations with that rule. I'm not saying that's a good rule, but it's a starting point.
Yeah.
It was the
We
minimum.
have that rule now
Yeah,
too.
we have that. That's the minimum.
Yeah. So anytime you need to call another team's stuff, it has to go out through WSO2.
Okay.
Or through our central API manager.
I think we can all agree to that.
And that one has
one's-
been,
We're past that one.
Yeah, we're past that point already, yeah.
Well,
But that was the starting point.
But we're not there. That's the thing, we're not there.
Well, we're not there as far as our
But that's the
implementation.
policy.
right,
Policy is there.
But that's
is
the
there.
policy.
Well, you
Okay.
have what Phil is saying here, though, right? He says that
Yeah,
even
no, it's
internal
policy.
APIs that you're using within a domain team or a team itself, they may want traffic shaping, monitoring, and metering, on their own APIs that are being consumed. Right? You can do statistics on that as well. So
Still value.
so there's still value there. So I think it might be a broader made policy talking about the PCI stuff, right? If you have a PCI audit, then you don't want to put the API manager in that.
No.
So it makes sense to kind of, let's not do in that instance. So maybe there's an external policy above and beyond that's restricting us having to go through an API management process. Otherwise, everything goes through API manager.
Now, just my opinion right now with this is as long as saying that within my domain, my API manager can be something like Amazon API Gateway, so my intra domain microservice calls go through that as opposed to going all the way back to campus to get to WSO2 and then back up to AWS. That sounds perfectly reasonable to me.
one of the things that Phil points out in this is to make sure that you don't, premature optimization is a serious problem. People are always saying,
Performance issues.
yeah, I'm worried about these performance issues that we have not ever seen
Experience.
yet. But we perceive that, and we do know that it's obviously less efficient to, at least we believe, to come to campus, go through WSO2, and then go back to Amazon. But you have no idea how Amazon is architected in the first place.
No.
So for all you know, Amazon is going from one data center to another to do exactly the same thing. And so, because you have no idea how it's architected, we are conceptually optimizing something that may not really,
Yeah.
we have this idea that all the Amazon servers are sitting next to each other in one data center. And we all know that's not how Amazon works. And so,
However, I would make the argument that what he's talking about with all these things that didn't turn out to be performance nightmares, I would argue that it's not so much that they didn't impact performance, it's that the cost value.
yeah, and there's always, anytime you put any instruction
Yeah.
in the pipeline for anything, you are going to impact performance because it takes time. Nothing is free.
Yeah.
The idea is now, especially nowadays, that the stuff that essentially is free because it is so performant that, that's sufficient for what a human can perceive
Yeah.
and, the problems that we were trying to solve. That worrying about that level of performance, because when we first started down the web services thing 10 years ago, marshaling, demarshaling were the big issue. If you kept everything in memory and then but you had to then take that data structure and put it on the web, you were taking a 2 orders of magnitude performance hit just by doing that. Well, now 2 orders of magnitude performance hit is like whatever,
Yeah.
because things are so performant that it doesn't matter.
Yeah.
And I think that's not to put words in Phil's mouth, but I think that's kind of what he's saying is, you don't worry about performance. You worry about the fact that we need to be able to do these things that he pointed out with discovery and security, identity, orchestration, those types of things that the API management platforms allow you to do. And some of those, when you're talking about microservices, you're probably not worried too much about orchestration.
Yeah.
Because you've designed, especially if you're in that little domain and you've just got your microservices talking to each other to accomplish a single thing. The thing that worries me as we talk about this is we use the term teams, which is what Bezos was using in his mandates that kind of came across to our mandates. And we use the term domains, but those have such a fuzzy definition that, is AIM a single domain, or is grade processing a single domain, or is it, so as long as I'm calling microservices related to grade processing, regardless of what they are, I can go ahead and not worry about doing anything with an API manager. That's kind of the part that worries me is when you use a term like that. And I think the interesting thing is I was reading.
And even more than that, Brent, is when you add team to that. We talked about domain.
If you add team, how many domains does Joseph's team cover?
Yeah, exactly.
So,
Too many.
yeah,
I
way
cannot
too
name
many.
them all off the top of my head.
And so now if we concentrate that down and say, okay, what if one of the things that Martin Fowler in the microservices discussion, I reread that today, getting ready for this discussion. One of the things he talks about with microservices is that microservices concentrated and organized around business needs, business properties, business events, and I can't remember the exact term he used. But so if you take that and you say, okay, well, what if the domain is payment manager, which is one you're playing with right now with microservices, and if that's my domain, so I've got payment manager, which is fairly contained, has some very interesting requirements because it does credit card processing, where it at least hands off to CashNet to do credit card processing and some things like that. If you start saying, okay, if my microservices are all together, so this domain Z has essentially been put together to manage a single business function. And when we talk about business function, we're talking about low-level business function, not grade processing. We're talking about, I'm going to post a grade. Well, in order to do that, I've decided to take that business logic to post a grade and break it up into 3 microservices. They're going to coordinate together because I'm going to raise an event, I'm going to do this. I've got one sitting there waiting for the event to happen so that I can then post it to the database or whatever it may be. If you start talking at that level, that might be the appropriate way to say, if your microservices are so focused, which is part of the intent of a microservice, is so focused on literally one thing and it's only part of a single business function, then it might be okay to say, okay, these 2 guys are just going to call themselves, they can call between them, because we chose to architect this with lambdas as opposed to architect it as one piece of code.
Yeah.
But when, and there really truly is no real interest in from anybody else of ever taking that, that one piece of a process. The whole process, yes, there is, the desire or the need to be able to externalize that process. Grade posting is something we want to externalize because we want to be able to open that up to all the LMSs that on campus that, there's 7, according to Troy, that were used this semester. 7 different LMSs were used on campus this semester. And so if you want to consolidate grade posting, obviously you want that business process available out there. But if your grade posting is 3 microservices and that's all they can ever do, then do you need it? That's the question.
And the 3 make no sense without each other.
Yeah, they are meant to coordinate.
They're through the same deployment pipeline.
Yeah, they're coming through the same deployment pipeline. They're coming through. They're not, because they're microservices. They are running in their own process space because that's one of the definitions of a microservice. But in essence, you would, if you're changing them around, most likely you're going to be touching more than one at a time because they are tightly coupled. Even though they're microservices, they are fairly tightly coupled. Regular services are, they better not be tightly coupled or they're useless. But I'm just trying to figure out where to draw that line.
I kind of like where that's going though. If it's not useful without the rest of the microservices in the bubble.
And it's never called by anything outside.
So
Yeah, it's not independently useful.
So there's basically, so what we've come up with so far is there's 2 there's 2 qualifications now that we're talking about. One is that there is some sort of a gateway that is sitting, that is public or that's callable and it is managed, and it is the only way that data goes to or from. You might be raising events or something like that, but in essence, there's a gateway function that makes this happen. And then, but once you're inside that domain, the pieces really cannot exist and function without the other pieces. So you've got this microservice, there's 3 microservices out there, whatever it is. They're relying on each other because you've decided to segregate your code that way for performance reasons in AWS, or just because you're so enamored with microservices that you turn everything into a microservice, even if it doesn't. So you have micro and then pico services because your microservices seem too big, and so you divide it, the division of responsibility, however you decide to coordinate that. Or in the case of certain things, you have like PCI compliance type things, where you got to come through the gateway. You're going to be interacting with my services, but my services, because of PCI, we don't want. We're willing to sacrifice some manageability just because we don't want to have to deal with the PCI audit crap.
But even then,
That's probably the easy one.
we both
Yeah,
there are only 2 functions that actually accept credit card information, and those can be segregated out from the rest of it. And everything else theoretically could come back through the API manager if we made that decision.
Well, and so then the question then is,
so-
because you're talking about these types of things, and he particularly pulls out the OAuth and some things like that, but you're talking about, besides security, which if you're talking about in your own domain, it's in a VPC. You cannot call it from outside without coming through a gateway. The gateway may handle OAuth and all of that kind of stuff. Inside your own domain, the Amazon API gateway might be perfectly sufficient, and the security bit that you need, even though they say not to use it for security, is just the API key.
Yeah.
So even if you can get in, you still have to have an API key in order to call me.
And in Amazon's case, you don't even need the API gateway from a Lambda to a Lambda. You can just call them directly.
Yeah, you can call Lambdas directly between, and then you have to figure out how you're going to pass identity back and forth.
Yeah.
But
honestly, API gateway is even harder inside there than just using IAM.
yeah.
So Brent, at the end of, I've got to go too, but at the end of this, we're going to have a list of, here's how we describe this, right?
Yeah.
So that's pretty tight.
Mhm.
One of those, you haven't talked, maybe I missed it, about events, raising events yet, but these things better not be raising events that anything outside would would consume, some things like that probably help.
Yeah, because if you're doing internal events, that's one thing. If you're raising events to the event hub or something external, how does that come into play?
I don't see why an internal microservice in that domain couldn't raise some,
I mean, its responsibility
events.
might be to raise events.
Yeah.
Well, that's exactly how I'm architecting payment manager. Is there's a microservice whose job is to listen to all of the internal events that are happening and know which ones it needs to send out to the external.
And in that case, it's most likely filling in an event, in kind of an event way, the microservices function.
It really
To
is.
say, I am the gateway, but I'm the events gateway. And so my job is
Inside
to,
out instead of outside in.
my job is to take whatever's happening inside and spit the events out. And I've decided that that's how I'm segregating things.
And I don't see a
Because
problem
that
with
ends up going through the API gateway.
Yeah.
And, in order to raise an event, you have to go through, with Event Hub, you have to go through the gateway.
Right, on the server.
On- yeah.
But on the client end, I don't see a problem with any of those microservices raising public event hub events. Especially if the URL to get back in only goes through that domain gateway.
And that may be all that needs to happen.
I mean,
So-
I still think it's probably a best practice to have kind of that filter sitting there that says, all right, this event is public, this isn't, especially because within our domain, we probably want to be passing around information that we don't want published publicly to the event hub. We want them to come get it from us.
Yeah.
So, within my domain, I may pass around the person's actual information about what happened. When it goes external, I just want to link to, here's the event, so that only authorized people can grab it.
Definitely have to segregate those public and private ones.
Yeah.
Domain
So-
events and interdomain
But-
events.
Anyway, that was mostly just to be an example of.
Well, and that's, definitely that's the domain team's architecture decision on how they want to do that. The issue is you got to make sure that once you publish an event to the Event Hub, that it's been sanitized to the point that you're not giving anything away that you shouldn't.
Yeah, for sure.
And we had a long set of discussions about that with the CES developers group over the last few days. as we started, architecting how they could use events and how they could take advantage of the bus that's already there. And, and they were, by the time we got done, they're all raising events on the bus.
Nice.
So they have their own domains and they're raising events on the bus. Thanks to Matthew, and they were, they realized it really wasn't all that hard.
It's a great exercise. The possibility we have in the domain, in the event hub event we define, you can give an obfuscated callback URL, right? And once you call that URL, it doesn't have any identifying information on the URL about what the resource you're getting. But once you call it, if you have access to call that API, then you can get that information out and then make the necessary API calls out of there. And that was one way that you could secure an event hub event without putting sensitive data inside of it.
This is a little tangential, but I think it was wise for people who made the event hub to put that domain in there, because that completely separates the BYU Idaho stuff from the
It does.
BYU Provo stuff. And just another comment, the WSO2, for those who may not know, WSO2 currently is just on-prem, but the plan is to also at least, if not, put it into AWS.
It will be lock, stock, and barrel in AWS.
Yeah.
That's
So
our
if you're worried
that's our
about that,
direction
It
for
will
Kelly.
be up there.
So, but it will be running, those gateway workers will be running in EC2 instances. And so how Amazon architects that internally between the EC2 instances and the Lambda functions and the API gateway and all that kind of stuff is completely out of our control.
That's right.
But the next update, with the mandate that we've been given, is it will be running in AWS. And Braden's all over that.
All
So,
over it. So
especially since now Idaho and Hawaii want our implementation.
I
So-
took the shot at the performance is kind of a strong end. But the thing that I really love about the intra-domain calling is the domain JWT.
Yeah.
Being able to pass my extra claims through my own little JWT,
Yeah.
which becomes a lot more complicated when you're going through
Well, you can
Central
attach
registry. But
the JWT in a separate header
yeah,
and send it through. There's nothing to require that the JWT has to be in the XJWT header. So you can get the standard one through the API manager, plus every other header is just passed.
yeah.
So it does not care that the other headers are there. And in SOASOFT, it used to, unless you explicitly told it, it would not pass headers, which tripped everybody up the first time they ever defined services in SOASOFT. But WSO2 does not care about the headers. It will pass them through. So, so if you really need that, and you want to, so if you wanted a second JWT, and you for whatever reason, and you're still going through the API gateway, you can pass it that way. And if it's signed and you have a place to go get those keys, you can put an OpenID Connect configuration file or a JWKS, JSON Web, JWKS file out there that has your public key in it. And
Well, that didn't even occur
you can do it that way.
to put it in
So, and then that but the other functions that seemed important, because Amazon's gateway, API gateway is not intended to be the same thing as WSO2. It doesn't have a store. It doesn't have, it's basically a way to put APIs in front of Lambda functions and then to proxy for anything else that you happen to have in AWS. It's not, it's not meant to be the whole WSO2 thing with all of that built in. And people have extended that, put Lambdas together that you can do OAuth with and all of that, but you may not need that.
even the authentication support in it, with all the custom authentication support, is very, very limited.
Yeah.
For example, you can only consider, the only input you can get into your authorization Lambda is the contents of one header. And you get to pick what that one header is, but all you get is one header. You don't get event body, you don't get any other headers. So you really can't do a lot of this effectively with API Gateway. You can't see, the original JWT and the current JWT, or the access token and the JWT. You can't see any of that, so you have to really go back through API Manager to really do OAuth with those services.
So,
It's great for validating the JWT that comes from API Manager, but it can't do much more than that.
so if we were to kind of summarize this, the discussion so far, and I have no idea what notes are going to come up when I click on this. So give me a new note. Okay, if we were going to summarize this, things that we've kind of talked about that really kind of need to be in that policy. One is all access to a particular I'm going to call it a subdomain, and I'll expand on that when I, some kind of domain, AIN, some kind of a domain gateway, and that's what we're talking about with this architecture right here. You've got some sort of domain gateway that it's the only way. Especially for API calls, it's the only way to get into your little set of microservices. And so that would be first. Okay, if we do that, it's funny that the dictionary on this box does not understand microservices. So it wants to break it up every time. I haven't fixed that yet, but okay. All microservices within the domain must reside in VPC.
Yeah.
A VAC. Like that must reside within a VPC.
How about a private subnet of the VPC?
No, I almost like that rule. They're on the same private subnet.
Or they're in the same VPC and the particular one in question is in a private subnet?
Yeah.
And can't be accessed from outside ever.
Yeah, then they can talk to each other.
Yeah.
'Cause,
That's
I
the
mean,
definition of a private subnet. You cannot get to it from outside ever. Only through a public subnet.
So here's where I'm coming from. I really don't have a huge objection to us saying every call's got to go through API Manager.
Mhm.
Except that I can just see that there's got to be something that we're forgetting about, some use case that we can't remember and that we can't foresee where that's going to cause a whole lot of trouble. Now we can also we can make exceptions in those cases. But
And that's the old directive really was, if you really want an exception, you had to go to Kelly to get the exception. And he was kind of the buck stops here. It's the way it needs to be. And part of that was because of the hesitancy of everybody to put stuff in. And in a lot of ways, I don't blame everybody. SOA 5 and SOA 6 were a real bear to put stuff in. We had a trained set of students, and they did 98% of the definitions of the stuff in SOA 5 and SOA 6. And that's fine because it was that bad. WSO2, I have a much harder time with people saying, oh, well, this is so hard. Because you give me a Swagger document, you drop it in there, the thing, if it's a decent Swagger document, even if it's just a skeleton Swagger document, you can just throw it in and you're off and running. And then if you want to enhance it, especially if you like the try it function, if you want to enhance that Swagger document, the try it function gets better and better and better with the more information it has in the try it. And that's what our CES guys found out yesterday is they're like, wow, where'd all these features come from in the try it? Because Wyatt I'm looking at Wyatt and pointing at Matthew. Matthew would, pulled up a I think you're adding an entity or something like
Yeah,
that.
in the event hub entity.
Yeah, he pulled up the event hub entity. Well, it has the model in the Swagger document. Build a model for him. And, they're like, whoa, how did you, well, it's just there because the Swagger is there and the model is there for that Swagger. Try It was actually, it's not a WSO2 product. It's a Swagger.io product that WSO2 is using. And so it understands Swagger docs. It has no problem at all saying, oh, okay, I know what that request body is supposed to look like. Here, let me give you a template. And you just fill in you don't have to remember what it is. You just fill in the values. And they were looking at it going, wow, you guys did a lot of work. Well, no, we didn't. We did the Swagger document, and just like CodeGen runs off Swagger, so does Try It. So,
Well, and especially when you consider, all right, my API gateway setup, that can either be imported or exported as a Swagger doc that I can then just plug into WSO2 directly, and I'm done. And if you have one Swagger doc that has the AWS extensions and the WSO2 extensions in there, and you just hand it to both places, they're in sync already, everything's happy. That's easy to automate right there.
I'm trying to figure out how to state the microservices must be.
My only comment so far right now is that a lot of this discussion is limiting to microservices and it extends beyond, because in my framework, my guys read this, they're just gonna go, that doesn't apply to me.
So maybe we need to prefix it with all APIs.
This is actually going to be, this will be written. I'm just trying to get the microservices piece of this. It will be an extension of what is already out there saying, if you have an API.
That's what I'm saying, because today, they weren't aware of that, of Kelly's, mandate, and so they've been going between student financials and HR without going through the registry, right? Just calling directly, because based on that example, we are going, it goes back to the definition of the domain, right?
Yes,
Because
exactly.
they're looking at it, PeopleSoft as a whole is this domain, because to get to any one of those three applications, you got to go through the PeopleSoft domain gateway. But the reality is, we can't monitor them, we can't throttle them, we can't, manage them because they're not going through.
And so, that becomes the question of,
And
for
some of
example,
them are going to be
if you're
public. That's a whole other discussion based on yesterday's discussion.
if you're in, if you're in AWS and the AWS gateway, API gateway is sufficient because of what it's giving and the environment that you're in, you'll notice what Phil did not say is it has to be WSO2. What he's saying it has to be managed. And if the API gateway inside of AWS is sufficient for what you need, because it does give you statistics and it will allow you to set throttling and it will let you, allow you to do some various things. It's not full featured. It's not like the WSO2 one, but if it gives you enough, then, you don't have to go back out to WSO2. The idea is that it's managed, not just, anybody can call it, anybody can hit it, and I have no way to tell what's going on. If the gateway that you have in PeopleSoft really gives us no way to tell what's going on, then that's probably not sufficient. But we could be using, instead of using WSO2, we could be using Kong, which is it's a very lightweight API manager that's out there. We could be using a number of other things depending upon what the need is. But I'm not going to write this saying everything has to go through WSO2, but everything has to be managed.
Well, so what you said makes it a lot more clear to me, because if I'm building interfaces between those PeopleSoft systems, number one, going all the way out to WSO2 and then having to come back in, there's going to be a performance hit, right? There always is. You're taking one more stop, there's going to be a hit. To me, it comes back to, is this API something that really needs to be public or not public? If it's not going to be public, it's only being used between these individual systems and they're going through the PeopleSoft gateway to get to each other anyway. To me, that sounds like that's sufficient. Because we can throttle, we can include PeopleSoft, we can monitor. Problem is, we aren't.
Yeah.
We're all logging and everything's by default turned off.
Yeah, and that's, I think that's the question is, if the PeopleSoft, just like the AWS gateway, if the PeopleSoft gateway allows you to do those things, the fact that we're not doing them, that's, because we're not throttling much in any of our other systems either. We should do a better job at throttling. We've been tempted to throttle certain organizations on campus on a regular basis, but we haven't done it. We've threatened them to say, you guys really need to fix your stuff or we'll just throttle you so you stop pounding us into the ground. But the gateways, to be perfectly honest, the gateways can keep up with what we're doing. 200 million transactions a year and the gateways aren't even breathing heavy. And so, that hasn't been an issue. But if the PeopleSoft gateway can do the stuff that Phil is talking about in his paper, then I don't see, it's like it doesn't have to be WSO2. And in that case, it probably doesn't make any sense for it to be WSO2 because PeopleSoft provides their own. Amazon provides their own that if you're going to do an API, you have to use Amazon's anyway. There's no way I can turn Lambda into an API without using API Gateway. That's how you do it. And so if it's sufficient for what you're doing, then to me that qualifies. And then the ones that are public, yeah, you put them out in WSO2 because that's our store. That's our public repository of APIs that are out there that are available for everybody to use, or at least available for everybody to ask to use, depending on the API.
Well, again, going back to like Duff and Doug's concern last night, with that issue of making public or private is a whole nother issue on top of that.
Mm-hmm.
With PeopleSoft, we need it to go through WSO2 because we need the actor component.
Yes, you need certain headers.
Within PeopleSoft itself, we can embed that actor component and bypass it because you're all within essentially the same VPC, right? And so you don't care. Whereas anybody else that's accessing it, to access our gateway, they have to go outside the firewall, which means they need that extra layer.
Yeah.
But again, it's determining, are these APIs just for internal processing? Okay, let's leave them alone and don't put them out there. And then we don't even have that question. Because if we did that with the time card one, we probably wouldn't even had this discussion yesterday.
Well, and time entry is used by
everybody.
It's used by everybody. It is probably the number 3 or number 4 hit API that we have in the old SOA registries. Control dates is number 1 by far. And then the time entry is really high on our list of utilization.
I say we get an average of 22,000 punches a day.
Yeah, there's millions per year because if you're calling it for punches, you're calling it to look up stuff, because the web interface uses it.
The individual punch.
Yeah,
that's not even talking about the query side of it. So.
Yeah, the web interface is using it for query, and then and so it gets a lot of hits, and which is okay. I mean that's what it was intended for. So, but so back to that, so basically what Phil's talking about here is that they need to be managed. If you can manage it with, if you can provide those functions, at least the ones you care about. You don't really care about orchestration, but your discovery, security, and all that kind of stuff is happening inside of that PeopleSoft API, PeopleSoft's own API gateway. That seems to me constitutes management. So that doesn't seem to be an issue. What we probably want to do on the PeopleSoft side is maybe do a better job of monitoring it. And mostly so you can react to when things aren't working. So, because if you've got a service call that's not working, how do you know? Something else breaks, but, that's not the greatest way to find out. It'd be nice if part of the nice part about having a management piece in there is you can go look at the management piece and say, okay, what is going on? Who's making these calls? I'm getting pounded to death because somebody accidentally put a web service call in an infinite loop. And so it's, driving everything into the ground. And we've seen that before. So, or we have in the portal, we have a fan condition where, it was like 3 layers deep, but basically what was happening is the portlet for class schedule was preloading the book. It would put up your class schedule and it wouldn't display it, but it would go preload the book list. So it was pounding every time anybody did anything, it would hit the bookstore to get the book list. Well, the bookstore would then turn around, and for every class that you had, it would turn around and call back into the class schedule to get, because, oh, it's this person this semester. Okay, I call back into class schedule and I get their class schedule. And we had this weird fan condition that ended up every time the portal would refresh, which happens anytime you change anything on the portal anywhere, not just in that portlet, it would, turn around and blast the bookstore again, which would turn around and blast us again. And the only way we found that, we had to walk our way back through the APIs and figure out, okay, what's going on. And we figured out what the portal was doing and tracked it back to the portal, because bookstore's going, we have no idea where this traffic's coming from. We're just getting hit a lot. And being able to manage when things break is, that's a lot of what I think Phil's trying to point at is you got to, if you have these tools in place, you can manage stuff like that. If you don't, you're looking at Apache logs.
Brad, can you look at your doing a little bit, right?
Yeah. Building a list. Basically, right now, what we're talking about is all access to particular subdomains must go through a domain gateway. So if you're going to have this, and I'll figure out how to word what a subdomain is, the wording that we've talked about here, but they have to go within through a domain gateway of some type, and that's usually a public-facing service. It's basically a gateway service to say, okay, I'm going to get to this set of microservices, but I'm only going to do it through this domain gateway. All microservices within the domain, within that subdomain, and I'll have to, like I said, I have to fix this, must reside within a private subnet within a VPC with no outside access possible. And that's an Amazon, that's an AWS terminology, but basically those microservices need to be isolated. And in Amazon, you do it through a VPC and then a private subnet. But in PeopleSoft, they're inside PeopleSoft, and so the PeopleSoft gateway and the service that they've published is the public piece, and then everything else is the stuff that PeopleSoft is calling inside of PeopleSoft is the private piece. And there's really no good way to get at those through PeopleSoft, because the only way you can get at PeopleSoft is through that gateway. So.
And just FYI for number 2, something in case somebody asks about it. If you're in a private subnet in a VPC, there's no outside access possible from the outside. You could potentially, if you want to, configure it so that inside could go out. Right. So
yeah.
Just FYI.
So like Joseph had pointed out right when you left and asked the event issue, Joseph has a microservice that's responsible for raising all Event Hub events. And so it can call out to raise that Event Hub event, and your microservices could call out to other services.
So you clarify that to say no access from outside.
Yeah.
Yeah. And you can obviously get access to it through the domain gateway, but no direct outside access.
Yeah. But
And then
no.
we're even better situated because even in and out both go through the gateway.
Oh, do they?
Yeah, everything is forced through the gateway.
Mhm.
So yeah, so PeopleSoft actually is more compliant than you thought. So yeah, it's a red letter day for Dave. So okay, microservices must not be able to. If you're talking about in this kind of a domain, that they really aren't meant to function independently. They are meant to rely on each other to accomplish whatever the business function that they are intended for is. If they can function independently, and they should be they're some sort of a public service.
Business event.
Yeah.
That's going to happen.
Yeah. There's no if they're separate business events, they need to have their own gateways or something like that. And that's not an excuse to say, okay, I don't have to go through.
If that's the case, then 2 probably won't hold either. They'll need to be accessible from outside.
Yeah.
And that's that. And so And then the overarching definition that I haven't put on the list is the fact that being managed does not mean WSO2. Being managed means you can accomplish what Phil had laid out in that, at least a portion of them, the ones that matter.
Ones that matter in your domain.
Yeah, orchestration may not matter. If you're, especially with microservices, you may end up that your domain gateway may end up calling one microservice, and that microservice might be doing the orchestration for you because it's kind of the driver of everything. Oh, I need to raise an event, so it puts an event on its internal event queue, and then Joseph's event raiser looks at it and says, oh yeah, I need to raise that one on the event hub. And oh no, I don't raise that one on the event hub. So it sanitizes it and throws it out there or whatever, however the architecture inside
There's sort of a
is.
minimum set, like 2 or 3 of those things that Phil said are just always going to be expected. Metrics of some kind, or-
I think we always want metrics and monitoring.
Yeah, so it handles this discovery, security, identity, interface uniformity, versioning, traffic shaping, monitoring, metering, and the one that he doesn't really have there that is really nice is that location independence piece. So
Put those in there.
yeah,
Okay.
and so because so that way if the internal API's location dependence is not quite as big of an issue because you're calling amongst yourselves. And if you're going to move it, you are so tightly coupled. If you're going to move it,
URL to it.
you're going to have to do something. Yeah,
Discovery is really
Way to go.
We're done.
Good.
so okay, I will flesh out the document and then send it off to people. So let's stop sharing.
Be back to 2019 again.
Yeah, we're back down to 2019.
With the videos thing though,